Olá! Damos as boas-vindas a todas as pessoas que nos acompanham em mais um encontro da nossa série Conversa com Autores, que coloca em diálogo colaboradores da Stanford Social Innovation Review Brasil. Eu sou Francesca Angiolillo, editora-chefe da Esse Brasil, e hoje tenho o prazer de receber aqui Dana Brakman Reiser e Marcel Fukayama para falar dos desafios que se colocam ao crescimento de empresas sociais. Dana Brakman Reiser é professora de Direito na Brooklyn Law School, em Nova York, da qual também é vice-diretora. Sua área de atuação inclui legislação para o setor não rentável e empresas sociais, tema no qual ela tem reconhecimento internacional. Entre as pesquisas que lidera está um estudo global que embasa seu artigo O Dilema entre Confiança e Escala nos Negócios Sociais, publicado em nossa edição de número 8. Marcel Fukayama é um empreendedor de impacto, atuando no estímulo a empresas sociais por meio da Dynamo, da qual é cofundador. Ele também é um dos fundadores do Sistema B no Brasil e atua no Sistema Internacional das B Corps. No mesmo número 8, em que publicamos o artigo da professora Brakman Reiser, contamos com um texto dele, Empresas Melhores para o Mundo, que fala sobre o contexto dos negócios sociais no Brasil. Essa conversa acontecerá em inglês e será legendada. Welcome, Professor Brakman Reiser. Welcome, Marcel Fukayama. We are thrilled to have you here and see you dialogue in person after having provided a dialogue between your texts on our 8th edition. So I should like to start with some definitions. So I will call Dana. Dana, could you please tell us how can we identify a social enterprise and in which ways they differ from their counterparts, please?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this conversation. It's very exciting to see the uptake on this work. So your question about definitions, you kind of pitched it as the way in, but it has taken up a huge amount of the research on this question, is just figuring out, well, how do especially researchers define terms so that we can make comparisons, right? What's the work that we're discussing today is comes out of a comparative project, and the only way you can effectively do comparisons is if you know you're looking at the same things in different places. So social enterprise is a really big concept of mixing essentially a desire to generate social good and a desire to generate profit for owners. And so you could do that in a lot of different ways, and organizations do that in a lot of different ways. And the kind of fuel mix that they're interested in terms of how much profit versus how much social good varies tremendously as well. And there also are some folks who talk about social enterprise as including commercial activities by nonprofit organizations, and I included that in our study as well. So for our conversation here, though, I think what a good working definition would be is an organization that is using business methods and engaged in commerce with a dual mission to be a profitable, successful business while having a mission to generate social good along some dimension. That might be in terms of employing workers, it might be in terms of environmental impact. There are innumerable ways that you can think about generating social good as a business. And the question of, well, how do we differentiate is really a very challenging question, because of course, your most standard business that's out there is also generating some social returns. And how do we identify social enterprises as a separate category is actually part of what a lot of the legal interventions in this area, both government and private, are trying to do, to distinguish which companies are truly different kinds of companies that are prioritizing social good in a way that makes them distinct and would justify various constituencies, customers and employees, suppliers, communities, governments, to repose greater trust in those organizations and perhaps be willing to expect kind of a lesser financial return, or a financial return on a different timeline from those organizations. So it's a little bit putting the cart before the horse to make a strict definition, because defining the term is really part of the legal project that that both Marcel and I have been working on.
I see. So your article, Dana, concentrates on the dilemma of profit versus trust and covers different countries' policies on that matter. So is that the biggest hardship that a social enterprise can face nowadays when it comes to operate to its full extent? Or what other aspects are worth mentioning to our viewers regarding the consolidation of a social enterprise?
Sure. So I think that, when you've seen one social enterprise, you've seen one social enterprise. So it's a little bit challenging to generalize. I do think that the dilemma between prioritizing the trustworthiness of the organization in the sense of how dedicated it will be to social mission and that differentiation from other kinds of companies that are out there comes into a lot of tension with a desire for scale. It doesn't always conflict with profit making. Sometimes it does, but not 100% of the time. But if you're trying to scale your intervention and you need to draw in capital to do that, then you run into a really significant dilemma in terms of how to kind of lock in trustworthiness. There are a variety of ways you could do that, and how those mechanisms might interfere with your potential sources of capital, right? If you have a more highly regulatory intervention, or if you have limitations on distributions, as I talk about in many of the countries that I study, that's certainly going to make capital providers potentially less interested in providing their capital that those organizations would need. So I do think on a kind of meta level for the sector, it's a really, really important tension to focus on. At the individual organizational level, this comes up as well, certainly, right? If you're trying to grow an individual business, that same dilemma can occur, right? Which kinds of investors to recruit, and how to assure them that your bona fides are real and genuine. So it can be replicated on that individual scale. But within organizations, I think what can be more challenging on that individual micro level is just figuring out how to operationalize the commitments that the founders have, right? How to turn this idea that I want to be a different kind of business into a business that in reality is a different kind of business. And what are the structures that I need to put in place to make sure that I can live those values? And that's where I think some of the work that Marcel's organization really can be extremely powerful on that individual organizational level, helping social enterprises to figure out, well, I want to prioritize my environmental mission. What would that look like? And how would that distinguish my practices with my employees, with my suppliers, with my manufacturing operations or transport decisions? How is that going to kind of that much more, kind of tactical level play out?
Okay, so now, Marcel, in order to introduce a national perspective, can you give us an overview of the social enterprises segment here in Brazil? How different it is compared to the American context, for example? How does it differ?
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Dana. Such a pleasure be here with you. Well, in Brazil, we do not have, formally saying, we do not have a concept of social enterprise. In Brazil, we have a for-profit company and non-profit organizations, basically. However, the constitution, the federal constitution of Brazil, brings much flexibility for businesses to promote positive impact or promote um, um, several principles in economic activities, including promoting um, 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 protection or preservation of environment, or facing inequalities, social and regional inequalities across the country. So these are some of the principles of our economic activity in Brazil. But the federal constitution is from 1988, and probably many of you who are listening to us, you might be asking yourself, hey, if this exists in our constitution, why it doesn't work? I mean, why we have so many businesses generating negative impact or doing harm in our society and our planet today? Is because there is a gap between the constitution, the principles of economic activity in Brazil, and the corporate law, and the conduct and the behavior of business administrators. So the corporate law in Brazil is also very innovative. This is from 1976, and this brings several elements, including the need to create public benefit, the demand to consider community members and workers in your decision making. So it is already a very innovative corporate law for the period that was created over almost 50 years ago. However, it is also not in practice for different reasons. So, what we need to realize is that there is a demand from society, from our planet, to have a better businesses that behave with positive impact, with purpose, accountability, and transparency. The purpose to not only mitigate and compensate negative impact, but also to generate positive impact in their value chain, in their work environment, in their business model, accountability with their stakeholders, not only the shareholders or their investors, but also their workers, their community members, their suppliers, as Dana was saying. So considering their stakeholders, taking their stakeholders in consideration in their decision making, short and long term, this is what we call accountability. And we say transparency is because transparency promotes behavior change. Transparency by using a third-party tool to manage, measure, manage, and report their impact. This is absolutely a disruption for behavior change in businesses. So, purpose, accountability, transparency. So these basically are the elements of the B Corp movement. B Corp movement was created almost 2 decades ago in the US, and now it is spread across almost 100 countries. There are almost 10,000 businesses that have been certified as B corporations. These businesses behave with purpose, accountability, and transparency, and they go through a rigorous process to manage their impact, and they meet a high standards in social and environmental impact beyond financial performance. So, uh, basically, based on these three elements, we have been advocating for a new corporate form. Why this is important? Because we need to identify these new economic segments. Otherwise, we'll keep um, institutions promoting rules of the game towards the old economy. We need to change the rules of the game to promote a new economic paradigm that is more inclusive, equitable, and regenerative. So, having identified this new economic segment, we can create and enable a whole institutional environment that is favorable for a new economy. We can design, implement, monitor public policies like public procurement. We can drive capital flow to this new economic segment. So since 2010, we have been advocating for a new corporate form called Benefit Corporation. We started in Maryland in the US, and more than 10 years later, we've been passing laws, legislations in over 44 American states plus 8 countries. So Italy, Spain, in Latin America, Panama, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Uruguay. So 8 countries plus US and also British Columbia in Canada. We've been passing these laws. It is a voluntary adoption though, but this is very important to help business administrators and also investors to identify this new economic segment. In case of Brazil, uh, it's we've been following a different path, and the different path is based on the national strategy of impact economy. This is policy, a state policy created during President Temer administration to 2017, and we've been implementing across different administrations, including Bolsonaro administration, Lula administration, and the goal of this policy is to enable an impact economy across the country, and it brings some definitions like what means impact economy, what means impact businesses, and uh, and also it brings some important expected outcomes like increasing the capital flow, increasing the number of impact businesses across the country, for strengthening intermediaries or backbone organizations that support the ecosystem, enabling a favorable institutional and normative environment for impact economy in Brazil. So these are some of the expected outcomes under this umbrella, this policy. Um, we've been gaining mandates from public administration in Brazil to foster this new economic paradigm, and because of that, we introduced some years ago, 2 years ago, a bill in the Senate to introduce benefit corporation in Brazil. There are some minor adjustments in this bill because of the Brazilian context, but it follows pretty much the same three elements of purpose, accountability, and transparency. The innovation in Brazil is that we are introducing a concept of stakeholder governance. So we, by law, we want business administrators to create a governance structure that includes stakeholders of their value chain. That brings more qualified, more consistent, more informed decision making for the administrators. So we are very much looking forward to it. It is still in process, but we are installing the conversation in the Congress and also in civil society.
So, thank you. Thank you, Marcel, for this answer. I would like to address you both now. You both mention in your articles, you point out different aspects by which regulations can dictate, help, or limit the performance of the social enterprise. Conversely, what are the paths to achieve a middle ground and establish a regulation that promotes the development of those enterprises? Which would be, if you could, from each of you point of view, um, define which would be the good things that one regulation could do in order to really make those enterprises flourish, please, in the different contexts.
So I can begin. So I think actually one of the key things that regulation, whether it's legislation or operating at an administrative level, is to help with that definition process, to really kind of help those different stakeholders that Marcel was talking about, to identify which organizations they should view as social enterprises, or and that's certainly what the benefit corporation legislation sets out to do. I think that it's very important, if you want to encourage the development of this sector of an economy, which it sounds really exciting that Brazil is committed to doing. I think that it is very important to make sure that when someone is seeking employment or seeking to place an investment or looking for a business partner, or as a consumer choosing a product, to be able to identify, well, which are the companies that are part of that new movement and which are the ones that are business as usual, right? And that maybe I do not want to patronize or work for or work with, or maybe I want to reduce my interactions with those business as usual companies to the extent that I can, and favor working with these, impact economy actors. So that's what I think law can do in a very helpful way. It doesn't have to be legislative. I think that can operate privately too, right, through things like certification. But providing that clarity to the market is really important, because it's very easy, right, for a business to say, hey, I'm a different kind of business, right? And I care about my workers and I care about the environment. And Marcel is absolutely right? Just claiming to have that kind of purpose is really not meaningful, and is not something that we want market actors to be responsive to if they're not truly accountable to having those different or broader purposes. And transparency helps with that kind of accountability. I absolutely agree with those principles. But I think part of what my comparative project and my research has been is to really look at what are the products out there doing that kind of identification. And they are very different in terms of the emphasis that they place, and the way that they choose to demand accountability from the organizations that they're going to identify is different. So the idea of using stakeholder governance is really innovative, right? You can see how that would be a way to keep companies on task with meeting the purposes that they claim, right? And that's a really interesting way to try to provide that necessary accountability, because you're just not, you're not identifying a new segment if anyone can get in and they don't have to have different practices. So stakeholder governance is one way that maybe that could work. Another is government regulation and oversight, right? Really demanding, either through disclosures that would be part of transparency to government, and some kind of enforcement apparatus, but that's super expensive, right? Another way you could do it is structural, right? And that's some of the work that I've been engaged in, looking at how some of these identification projects really limit the distributions that can be made to investors, to kind of put a structural limit on the focus on profit, and the hope that it will in turn result in more of a prioritization of the social mission. So there are a lot of different ways that these identification mechanisms could choose to produce that kind of accountability. But they have to do something, and it needs to be effective, right? Because if you're just creating a new identifier and it doesn't actually do the work of sending a genuine, reliable signal to those communities, then actually it's worse, right, than having nothing, right? Because it allows business as usual organizations to masquerade as impact economy businesses, and you're not getting the kind of sorting, right, that a market typically would help us to get to, if that's the desire on the part of the populace to change the way business operates. So I think the most important thing that regulation can do is produce some kind of identifier, or that law can do more broadly. It doesn't even have to be regulation. It's to produce some kind of reliable identifier. And what I'm interested as a researcher is, well, how well do these different types of identifiers actually serve that goal of signaling, right? I'm now developing some work to look at, different approaches, right? Compare how stakeholder accountability works compared with capping distributions, compared with government regulation and oversight, right? What's the right way to get that mixture, right, of accountability mechanisms that are going to generate the trust that I think is super important, without dampening too much, right, the ability to get the scale that we need to really make the impact, right? Transforming just a handful of companies is great for them, but it's not going to have that, countrywide or global impact that is the overall goal of something like, shifting the economy.
I think, in addition to Dana's point, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have over 125 million businesses in our planet, according to the World Bank. So it's a lot, and you have 10,000 certified B Corps. So how can we empower all businesses to behave with purpose, accountability, and transparency? Dana's research is very important because it brings a multimodal way to approach such behavior change. And this change can be through structural change, as she was pointing out, or it can be through self-regulations. The challenge that we have is the sense of urgency. And if we rely on exclusively on the voluntary of investors and businesses to promote such behavior change, We may not have the result in the time that our society and our planet have. So, having said that, Dana's research also brings different types of frameworks across the globe. One of them that I think it's quite important to highlight is the CIC, the Community Interest Company in the UK, that brings a very interesting proposal to limit profits in business in businesses. That brings three main elements: asset lock, dividend cap, and mission lock. It's a very interesting model that may not be an appropriate model for everyone. So that's why benefit corporation is more flexible in terms of profit management, because in the sense of what you do with your profit, it's up to you as business. Uh, but the way how you make a profit, it matters, which means that we are bringing um, these three elements, but that there is one of them that is absolutely crucial: the impact management tool, to assure that the way how you make your profit, it matters, and how you engage your value chain in this profit making, it is also important. And the second point about this is the social control, which means stakeholders do have an important role in holding companies accountable and assuring that administrators are operationalizing their commitments to generate positive impact. And this
Mhm.
positive impact is amended by the fiduciary duty of the administrators, so they can be legally sued by stakeholders in case they do not follow such commitments. So this is uh, a framework. This is not the silver bullet, but this is an alternative to help in fostering behavior change in business sector.
I see. I was thinking while I was listening to you both that maybe to a certain extent, there's a moral question about profit that underlies the discussion. And it might be difficult to to turn this moral issue into regulation. And because a business needs profit to be to operate, and as profit goes against social interests sometimes. So that's the the birth of the dilemma, as I understand from my uh, point of view of someone who is not studying the actual regulations. So I was thinking, what is personal? What in a individual way, from inside out, those enterprises? What can one do from the point of view of someone who is working inside one of those social business or social enterprises or B Corps that can be done in the day-to-day day-to-day routines of a business to better and to be more accountable, to be more respectful of the missions? And what if we can imagine to bring these questions to a more personal point of view that is not from the regulation point of view? What could you do or say about that? I don't know if I make myself clear. I was wondering about this internalizing of this question of what am I doing here with this business? What is my personal mission within this? So I would just like to hear your thoughts about this more sort of philosophical approach to the question too. So
Uh, I can jump in just to kick off. We have a sense of urgency. We need that everyone, every single person on this planet becomes an agent of change. Um, so, having said that, regardless where you are, public sector, private sector, social sector, let's say that you are working for a business, you can be a change agent by doing these three things: purpose, accountability, and transparency. So, first of all, um, can your business adopt a legal framework or a legal language that amends the fiduciary duty of the administrators with positive impact? This is one question. The second one, how can you qualify your decision making to not consider only shareholders, only investors, only profit making? But the point uh, of profits is that because we are considering only one dimension of profits and financial return, what about social and environmental benefits? And in order to qualify this decision making, can you bring your community members or workers in your decision making? How can you shape your governance structure to do so? In some jurisdictions, you can create like a stakeholder committee. In others, you can appoint some of these stakeholders to your board of directors, and so on, so on. Um, and the third, can you adopt tools to help you in your performance standards and your reporting standards? There is a normative tsunami happening across the globe, mainly in Europe, to change how businesses are managing impact and reporting this impact. So the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, created by the IFRS during COP26 in Glasgow, is a disruptive action for this, because this can bring a standard for social and environmental metrics for the whole world. And then we can have a comparative analysis to every single business in our planet in their social and environmental performance. We are not there yet, but we'll get there. I'm sure that we will. So um, if you are a person in this business, you can adopt these several tools like the Global Reporting Initiative or SASB or IRC or even the B impact assessment in your performance standards. So uh, it depends on each one of us, and I think you can start today.
So for the most part, I would agree with what Marcel has just said. I think that involving, more voices in your governance, even if you are not in a jurisdiction where a stakeholder board or formal invitation into the governance process is possible, it is still possible to think about the diversity of the folks who sit on your board and what are their experiences and how might they be able to have those broader considerations in mind as they make strategic decisions for the organization. I think it's very important to think operationally. Again, as I was saying, at the micro level, right? Which is not where most of my research is, but from being in the space, what I see are people who have good intentions, right? All the folks who are asking the question that you are, Francesca, how do I make a difference? How can I do it better? And just figuring out what tools might help you to turn that moral commitment into an action that's specific to your particular business space. There are a lot of tools out there that can be really helpful in doing that. And Marcel mentioned several of them. The different reporting standards and the different assessments that are out there really can key someone in, right? So if you're being asked the question, how does your company deal with how it sources its inputs, right? Well, then you can think, how do we think about how we source our inputs? That's a way to, bring this social question into our actual practices. So I think using those tools is really powerful. My only point of departure, I think, from Marcel is to think about fiduciary duty. I personally am pretty skeptical, at least in the American context, and I certainly can't speak for a very different legal context like Brazil. And in many places, fiduciary duty may be a really useful tool in this regard. In the US, because fiduciary duty and litigation, particularly about fiduciary duty, is the province solely of shareholders, right? Only shareholders can sue to challenge compliance with fiduciary duty. I think it's very challenging to get out of that focus on a return of value to shareholders as the primary goal, when the whole structure is that the only enforcement operationalization happens by shareholders, and it's costly. So they're only going to do it if there's some kind of financial value in pursuing that goal. So I think it's helpful to train fiduciaries themselves to think about these alternative measures and alternative ways to judge, right, what is a good decision. But I don't think the kind of legal enforcement through litigation around fiduciary duty is a particularly promising avenue, I think, to make change here, at least in the American and American type contexts.
So I thank you very much, both of you. We are reaching the end of our transmission. I was very happy to have you here and see your ideas in movement now, not only in words. And I thank you again very much for your time, and thank you all that are watching us for being here with us, and maybe think about a future in which all corporations can be social corporations, because we need them to be socially and environmentally oriented. At this point, we have not very much of an option regarding the actual state of things now. So I thank you very, very much, Professor Dana Brakman Reiser, Mr. Marcel Fukayama. Thank you for being here with us, and goodbye.
Thank you.